Thank you so much. It's awesome to be here to talk about my new book, Radical Respect. I actually just got a copy of it today. And Radical Respect is really the prequel to Radical Candor, which is a book about feedback. And if you write a book about feedback, you're going to get a lot of it, and indeed I did. And hands down, the best feedback happened when I was giving a Radical Candor talk at a startup in San Francisco, and the CEO of that company had been a colleague of mine for the better part of a decade, a person I like and respect enormously, and so I was really excited to give this talk. And when I finished the talk, she pulled me aside and she said, "Kim, I'm really excited to roll out Radical Candor. I think it's going to help me build the kind of innovative culture that I need to build here, but I got to tell you, it's much harder for me than it is for you." And she went on to explain to me that as soon as she would offer someone even the most gentle, compassionate criticism, they would call her an angry black woman. And I knew this was true as soon as she said it, and I knew how unfair it was, because she's one of the most reasonable, cheerful people I've ever worked with. And as soon as she said this to me, I had 4 realizations at the same time. The first thing I realized was that I had failed to be an upstander. I had not been the kind of colleague that I imagined myself to be. I had failed to intervene with this when this happened to her. Instead of being an upstander who intervened, I was really like a silent bystander, or even an oblivious bystander, because it had never once occurred to me, until she said that to me, the toll that it must take on her to have to show up unfailingly cheerful and pleasant in every meeting we were ever in together, even though she had what to be pissed off about, as we all do at work from time to time. And so that was a hard thing to realize. But the second thing that I realized was that not only had I been in denial about the kinds of things that were happening to my friend as a black woman in the workplace, I had also been in denial about the kinds of things that happened to me as a white woman in the workplace. Kind of hard for the author of a book called Radical Candor to admit that I had been pretending that a whole host of things were not happening that were in fact happening. And so when I was harmed by disrespectful attitudes and behaviors, I pretended they weren't happening instead of choosing a response. And I think part of the reason I did that was that I never wanted to think of myself as a victim. But even less than wanting to think of myself as a victim, that I want to think of myself as the culprit. So I realized, the third thing I realized was that I had been most deeply in denial about the times when I was the one who had the disrespectful attitudes or behaviors that harmed my colleagues and prevented them from doing their best work. And because I was in denial, I couldn't acknowledge what I had done wrong and make amends. Last but not least, I imagined myself to be the kind of leader who created these bullshit-free zones where people could do the best work of their life and build the best relationships of their career. And yet, as a leader, because I was in denial about these attitudes and behaviors, I could not prevent them from destroying the culture on my team. So that's a big drink of water to have in just a couple of minutes, but that's the value of feedback. It made me sit down and write a whole new book. So what do I mean by radical respect? You know I love a good 2x2. Radical respect is what happens when we optimize for collaboration rather than coercion, and when we honor everyone's individuality rather than demanding conformity. It's the kind of team where the strength of the team is the individual, and the strength of the individual comes from the team. And we all know that's what we want to create when we build a company. I've never met any founder, any leader who says, "Oh, I want to create a coercive work environment." We know that collaboration is how we get the best work out of people. And I've never met anyone who says, "Oh, I'm dying to work in a 1984 style, everybody's marching in lockstep kind of environment where we're demanding conformity instead of honoring individuality." That hardly seems innovative. So what could possibly get in the way of radical respect? What sends us in the wrong direction? I think there are 3 basic problems: bias, prejudice, and bullying. And one of the problems with these 3 things is that we conflate them as though they're the same thing. And then the problem seems monolithic. and impossible to solve. But we are here in Silicon Valley where we break big problems apart and we solve them. So let's break this one apart too. I want to offer you some super simple definitions so you can begin to distinguish between these three attitudes and behaviors so you can know what to do about them. Bias is just not meaning it. It's unconscious. Whereas prejudice is meaning it. It's a very consciously held belief, usually incorporating some kind of unfair and inaccurate stereotype. And last but not least, bullying. Bullying is just being mean. There's no belief, conscious or unconscious, whatsoever going on with bullying. So what do we say when we notice these things? Because very often, I mean, how many of you were left gobsmacked in a meeting recently where something happened and you didn't know what to say? So what can you say when you don't know what to say? If you think what just happened is bias, try an I statement. An I statement kind of holds up a mirror and lets the other person recognize what they're doing wrong so they can change their behavior. They don't mean to do it. One of my favorite stories about disrupting bias comes from Aileen Lee, who you all talked to last night. She told me a story about going into a meeting with two colleagues who were men. Aileen sat down in the center of the table because she had the expertise that was going to win her team the deal, and her two colleagues sat to her left. When the other folks came into the room, the first person sat across from the guy to Aileen's left, the next person sat across from the guy to his left, and then everyone else filed on down the table, leaving Aileen dangling by herself. Anybody ever notice bias show up in that way? Just like who sits next to whom? Now I've made all of y'all super uncomfortable. But anyway, that is what happens often. Aileen started talking, and when the other side had questions, they didn't direct them at her, they directed them at her two colleagues who were men. It happened once, it happened twice, it happened a third time, and finally one of her colleagues stood up and he said, "I think Aileen and I need to switch seats." That was all he had to do to totally change the dynamic in the room. And he did that for three reasons. The first reason was that he liked Aileen and he didn't like seeing her getting ignored. So there's kind of an emotional component to being an upstander. The second reason he did it was because he wanted to win the deal. And he knew if the other side wouldn't listen to Aileen, they weren't going to win the deal. And then the third reason he did it was sort of for efficiency reasons. He knew it was going to be easier for them to hear it from him than from her. Not that she couldn't speak up for herself, but for the sake of the people to whom he was holding up a mirror, it was going to be easier for them to notice if he did it. So that was all that had to happen. Dynamic changed, meeting went on, they won the deal. However, if it's prejudice and not bias, holding up a mirror is not going to work because that person is going to grin in that mirror. They're going to like what they see. So in the case of prejudice, you need an it statement. An it statement shows the boundary between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want, but they can't impose that belief on others. And to use an it statement, you can appeal to the law, you can appeal to an HR policy, or you can appeal to common sense. So, for example, shortly after I came back to work from maternity leave, I was chit-chatting with a guy before a meeting, and he said to me, "Oh, my wife doesn't work because it's better for the children." And this was like a gut stab for me, but I didn't think he meant it. So I tried to make a joke. I tried an I statement. I was like, "Oh, I decided to show up at work today because I choose to neglect my children." And I had twins. And I was expecting him to laugh and move on, kind of like you all just did. But no, he doubled down. He's like, "Oh no, Kim, it is not good that you are working." So now I know this is not bias, this is prejudice, and I need an it statement. And so I said to him, "It is an HR violation for you to tell me I'm neglecting my children by showing up at work today." And that had the desired effect. He backed way off. But I didn't want to make a thing of it with HR because I needed to keep working with this guy. So I said, "Look, I'm not going to make a big deal of this, but I think we can agree that," now I'm appealing to common sense, "it is my decision, together with my partner, how we raise our children, just as it is your decision, together with your partner, how you raise your children." And he breathed a sigh of relief, and we managed to work together better after that. But I needed to say something in that moment. Now, in the case of bullying, an I statement is not going to work. An I statement kind of brings someone in closer. In the case of bullying, you want a you statement. You want to kind of push them away. I learned this from my daughter when she was in 3rd grade. She was getting bullied on the playground, and I said to her, as adults often do to kids in such a situation, "Oh, tell this kid, I feel sad when you blah, 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 blah." She banged her fist on the table, and she said, "Mom, they are trying to make me feel sad. Why would I tell them they succeeded?" That was a really good point. And I realized what you need to say in the case of bullying is a you statement. You can't talk to me like that. Or a you question, what's going on for you here? Why are you behaving this way? Or even just a you non sequitur. Where'd you get that shirt? The point of a you statement is that you're not accepting what they're dishing out at you. You are in an active stance. So there's tons more to be said about all of this, but these are just some quick thoughts for if you think what you just noticed was bullying, start with the word I, see what comes out of your mouth next. If you think what just happened was with prejudice, use an it statement to appeal to the law or to an HR policy or to common sense. And if you think it is bullying, try to say the word you and then just notice what comes out of your mouth next if you don't know what to say. This is a momentum game. You got to get the ball rolling. Now, one of the reasons that I wrote Radical Respect is to say thank you to all of the upstanders in my career who helped me out of any number of tough spots. And the last thing I want to do is to put people who are upstanders in a bad situation. So I want to acknowledge that while intervening directly can be great, sometimes it's not safe for you to do it, or it may not be practical for you to do it. You can also delay. What do I mean by delay? Check in with whoever was harmed by what happened after the situation. This is really valuable if you do it. I will tell you about how it feels if it doesn't happen. At one point in my career, I was giving a talk to about 5,000 people. And the leader of the organization that managed all these 5,000 people was up on stage, and I stepped onto stage with 2 colleagues who are men. He shook the first guy's hand, he shook the second guy's hand, and then he introduced me, and I stuck my hand out for him to shake it. And instead of shaking my hand, he kissed it, kind of licked it. You know, it was like one of those terrible moments, little spit on the back of my hand. And so that was bad enough. That was a little bit disgusting. But the real problem happened after the talk, when not a single person came up to me and said, "Ooh, do you need a little hand sanitizer?" Or "That was weird." And then all of a sudden I started to feel gaslit. So you want to just check in with a person later. That can have a huge impact to dispel gaslighting. Another thing that you can do is you can create a distraction. Spill your coffee, just like change the game that way. Another thing you can do as an upstander is you can delegate. You can prevent the silent bystander effect by catching someone else's eye and asking them to intervene. And you can delegate up, down, or sideways. You can delegate to anyone. And last but not least, you can document. We're all carrying movie cameras in our pockets. So document what happened, but remember, you do not own that documentation. The person who was harmed by the disrespectful attitude or behavior owns it. So those are a few things you can do as upstanders. But what about leaders? What can leaders do to make responding to these problems expected? Leaders have a role to play, but leaders, of course, can't do it alone. They need bystanders as well. Upstanders, not bystanders. So in the case of bias, as a leader, you can create a norm on your team where bias gets disrupted, and it gets disrupted publicly. Bias is a pattern. We as human beings are pattern makers. And sometimes we make bad patterns and sometimes we make good patterns. But if we don't disrupt the bad patterns and disrupt them very openly, then we reinforce them. Now, what about prejudice? As a leader, the best thing you can do is to create a space for conversation on your team so that everybody is on the same page about where that line is between one person's freedom to believe whatever they want, but not to impose those beliefs on others. Because it's very easy for me to stand up here and say there's this line, really hard to define where it is, and there's no one right answer. Every team has got to make that clear. So create space for conversation. Take a look at some stuff that happens in the world and imagine it happening on your team. What would you all do? Talk about it. And last but not least, bullying. You have got to create consequences for bullying on your team, because if you don't create consequences, the bullying is just going to escalate. There's 3 different kinds of consequences. You want to create conversational consequences. You need to learn how to shut it down in the moment when you notice it. You also have to create compensation consequences. You don't want to give high ratings or bonuses or extra equity to people who bully others. Atlassian has a really good rule, the no brilliant jerks rule. No matter how good a person's results are at Atlassian, if they bully their teammates, they cannot get a high rating, they cannot get a bonus. The third thing you want to do is you want to create career consequences for bullying. Whatever you do, do not promote people who bully others. There is a moment on every team's history when the jerks begin to win, and that is the moment when the culture begins to lose. You want to, instead of promoting that person, give them feedback. Let them know why they're not getting promoted. And if they can't change their behavior, you've got to fire them. It is better to have a hole than an asshole. Remember that. All right, words of wisdom up here. All right, let's take a couple of minutes and kind of double click on what I mean by bias disruptors. 3 steps to disrupting bias on your team. The first step is you want to come up with a shared vocabulary. What are the things that you and your team are going to say? What's the word or phrase that you or your team are going to say when you notice bias? I like to use a purple flag. It's a friendly purple flag. It's not a yellow flag. It's not a red flag. Another team that I worked with used an I statement. I don't think you meant that the way it sounded. Another team that I worked with had kind of a cat theme going on, and they would meow at each other. Whatever it is, whatever your team will say, get them to say it, but make sure that there's a shared understanding of what it means. You as a leader of your team, you're not the word police. You can't dictate these terms. Next, you want to have a shared norm for what to do when it's you whose bias is being pointed out. Because I don't know about you all, but when someone tells me that I've said or done something biased, I feel ashamed. Like, I can tell you where I feel it in my body. I feel a tingling in the backs of my knees. It's the same physical feeling that I get if my children walk too close to the edge of a precipice. It's a real fear response. And then I'm in fight or flight mode. I'm in lizard brain, and I've got to re-engage my executive function. So teach people to just say, thank you for pointing it out, and either I get it and I'm working on it. And this is hard. I was working with one CEO who was trying not to stand up in front of his whole company and say, you guys, because not everyone on his team was a guy. But this was a deeply ingrained pattern of speech, so it took time. He had to buy rockets for the whole team, those little styrofoam rockets on a rubber band, and they got to shoot it at him every time. So be patient with yourself, but also persistent. So I get it, I'm working on it, or I don't get it. And this I don't get it thing is really hard to say, because now what I'm saying is I'm ashamed because I've hurt someone, and I'm ashamed because I'm ignorant. I don't know what I did wrong. But we are all in this situation. We are all bound to be in this situation probably multiple times a day. So normalize, get people used to saying this on a regular basis. And last but not least, you've got to have a shared commitment. You've got to have a shared commitment, because if you don't embrace the discomfort, like no matter how much you talk about this before you do it, it's going to be uncomfortable and you're going to stop doing it. You've got to build the stamina to keep doing this. If you can do these things, you will begin to build the kind of core respect that is essential for radical candor, because you're not going to care about people or challenge them directly if you don't respect them. I'm going to do an Ask Me Anything in a minute, but for now, I want to say thank you all so much.